Hey everyone, Cara here, and I just wanted to tell you right up front how excited I am that the very podcasting platform that I use, Zencaster, is now a sponsor of the show. Stay tuned, and you will hear why I love working with Zencaster so much. You will get access to a discount code so you can love working with the Zencaster too, and you'll learn about how Zencaster helps make Talk Nerdy possible. All right, here we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is, you guessed it, Monday, January 17th, 2022. That is, I have to literally look at the date when I read that because otherwise I'm not going to say it. January 17th, 2022. And I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. I've got a great episode for you. I'm in a good mood. It's going to be a really fun one. But before we dive into that, I do want to thank those of you who help make Talk Nerdy possible week after week after week after week, because Talk Nerdy is and will always be, I have pledged this, 100% free to download. That's because I do really rely on the support of listeners just like you. So if you want to pledge your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy, and you can learn how right there. This week, I want to thank my top tier supporters, including Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, Dudas Infinitas, Gabriel F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, June Sapara, Leonard Prince, and Ulrika Hagman. And hey, let's try something else. I want to also give a shout out to those of you who over time have significantly contributed to the show. Just because you're not in the top tier now, or you no longer are, you are still, you have always been and will continue to be so incredibly important to the show. And that includes folks like Brian Holden. I think I already said Brian Holden, sorry. Jeffrey Sewell, Rob Schreck. Who else? We've got Juan here. We've got another Juan, this time Juan Gutierrez. We've got Ken Pfeiffer, Charles F. Bleal. Maybe it's Blale, I'm not sure. David Compton, Jacob Rochester, Doug Petitpierre, love that. Christian Jeffrey, Howard, Wolf Witt, Bill Hamilton, Nick Hilton, Krista Roberts, so many cool people. D Laser, I dig that, really dig that. Thank you all so much for your support. Okay. Let's talk about this week's show. So I had the incredible opportunity to sit down once again, virtually, of course, with my dear friend, Laurie Winkless, who is an incredible science writer. And she has a new book. You may remember her from when I had her on the show, get this, in 2016. What? To talk about her first book, Science in the City. This time she has a new book called Sticky, The Secret Science of Surfaces. It's so good. I can't recommend it enough. It is on sale in the US starting on February 1st, which means you can go online right now and pre-order, and the day it becomes available, it will show up at your door. So without any further ado, the author of Sticky, The Secret Science of Surfaces, here she is, Laurie Winkless. Laurie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm so happy to join you, Cara. It's lovely to hear your voice.
It's been too long. I was just looking, and your last, the book that I had you on the show to talk about the first time was Science in the City, was published in 2016.
I know. I feel like the last 2 years we can kind of just ignore. But
Right.
even so, it's still
Even
such
so,
a long
then I'm
time
like
ago.
3 years out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the last time I saw you, when I spoke to you, when we actually did our recording, we did the recording when I was visiting New Zealand, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did. We did the first one, but then your laptop took a little trip. If I remember correctly.
That's why my memory was so weird about it, because I was like, I remember doing this remotely with you, but I also remember totally hanging out with you in New Zealand and talking in depth about your book. That's because I interviewed you twice. No.
Yeah, indeed. You just loved it so much you had to do it twice.
I did. Oh, I'm so excited that you have a new book. I'm so excited that you are continuing the sort of journey into your true passion, which really is like physics, materials engineering. Your last book, we did discuss quite a bit, obviously, on the show, Science in the City. Is it safe for me to sort of summarize it as a deep dive into the structures, the functions, the things that make the city go, the things we often don't think about that are required to make the city go?
Yeah, that's a really good description. I kind of partly laughingly described it as my scientific love letter to the great cities of the world, because that's what it felt like. So yeah, that's a good description, Car.
And then when I found out you were writing a new book called Sticky, I guess I didn't quite realize right away that you were focusing on sort of the physics of things that stick, of friction, of how things connect with one another, and all the different ways that manifests. And I was like, that's a big turn to go from the city to stickiness, but really it's not a big turn at all, is it?
Yeah, well, for me, this is a bit closer to what my research background was. To be honest, my interest in cities was partly driven by the fact that I was living in London. I'd moved from a relatively small town to this metropolis that just seems to move, and everyone moves around by tube, and the scale of everything is big, and that is what really kind of inspired Science in the City, more so that than my actual kind of professional expertise or my research background. Whereas Sticky is a lot closer to the type of research that I was doing when I was at the National Physical Laboratory. A lot to do with surface interactions, friction, water repellent surfaces, lots of things like that. They were all topics I did lots of research on when I was a working scientist. So in a way, it kind of feels closer to like a more obvious topic almost for me to cover. But in saying that, it is very different from Science in the City. It feels different. I think it reads differently. But I think that I'm really happy with the outcome of it. And I think that I've managed to capture lots of interesting topics, and probably more importantly, to interview some amazing, amazing scientists and engineers and historians and artists, for this book. So yeah, it's been a fun one. It's been a long, long road, but it's been a fun one.
I can imagine, kind of going back to your roots a little bit, your academic interest, but having worked as a science communicator and a science journalist for so long and really doing a lot of broad science reporting. Um, did you have to relearn a lot of things? Was it sort of you
Oh
have to
yeah.
dust off some cobwebs?
Definitely. Like, it was actually terrifying in some ways to look back at. I found lots of my old papers and lab reports and all. I've always been good at keeping notes, so I had really lots and lots of notes from the experiments I used to do. But sometimes, yeah, reading them, I was like, whoa, I used to know all this stuff. So yeah, there were definitely some cobwebs that needed to be dusted off. But that's, for me, that's a big motivator. I love learning. It's pathetic to say that, but it is. Nothing drives me more than learning something new, or relearning something old in some cases. So yeah.
Oh, I love that. And so before we dive into sort of the content, the what the book is and all of the things that you did have to relearn and then the new things that you learned, of course, I'm curious about your experience because you're a transplant, right? Like you grew up in Ireland and then you went to the big city in London and then you found yourself in New Zealand. And I'm wondering about, like you were saying that the move to the city influenced your last book. Now you're sort of going back to your roots, but you're across the globe from where those roots were first planted. And I'm curious about this idea of geography and location, and of course the pandemic, which has kept many of us from traveling. Was there any sort of influence on your space, the place you are in space? Was there any sort of influence on this new book at all?
Man, what a great question. It's been an odd process, if I'm honest, because when I moved to New Zealand at the end of 2016, I had the beginnings of the idea for this book. I had kind of done an initial pitch, I guess, to my publisher, or at least I brought up the idea of the book. but it was pretty malformed. And in my naivety, I thought, yeah, we're going to move to New Zealand. I'm going to get settled in really quickly. I'm going to keep working on this book proposal, and I'm going to get all this work and all this freelance work. And of course, moving to the other side of the world, even if you have a husband who's from that country, he has roots here, and now I have too. Was incredibly discombobulating, to be honest. And also, I live in a much smaller city than London, so I also changed. My scale changed again, which,
Right. Even the big cities in New
yeah,
Zealand are not
yeah,
that big.
no,
Yeah.
exactly. And you've been to Wellington, right?
Yeah.
It's not big. So, but it is a lovely place to live. But I think that I just hadn't quite understood the impact that changing my place that would have the impact it would have on my ability to think and my ability
Yeah.
to kind of package up an idea for a book. So kind of right at the beginning, it was really tough, but eventually I kind of developed the proposal and worked it a few times, because initially I think Bloomsbury thought it was a bit niche, which is probably fair enough. So when I actually got the kind of signed the contract to write the book, quite a lot of time had passed. Really, more than a year had passed of living here. So by then I'd started to kind of find my feet. And started to get to know some scientists and engineers and other science communicators here in New Zealand. And that helped a lot. Um, some of the topics in the book were inspired by New Zealand. I have a whole chapter on earthquakes. And, as a Californian, you know that the seismic activity is just kind of part of daily life. And that's very much the case here. And
Yeah.
I was kind of ignorant about the mechanisms or the mechanics of earthquakes. So I knew that I was in the best place in the world possible to kind of uncover those answers. So there's lots of New Zealand itself kind of woven into the narrative. But certainly, I think being here and being very far from most of my family, I haven't actually been back to Ireland since it's almost 4 years now. Well, it will be 4 years in September, which is much much longer than I ever thought it would be. That's been really difficult, but I'm sure that it's had an impact on the types of stories I wanted to tell, and certainly of the people I wanted to feature. I wanted to make sure I was featuring people from kind of all over the place in a way to kind of help ground me, possibly.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I feel like lately I've been so fascinated. I love talking to authors about the content, right, of their stories because that's what they've been poring over for so long and those are the stories that they've shared with us. But I'm also always really curious about process. I think it's so unique to the individual and we are in these very strange times where our geography, where our connections, our communications, our interpersonal relationships, it's almost like we've taken a few steps back in time because of the restrictions that have been placed on us because of this pandemic. So yeah, it's quite curious the way that that people are sort of relearning how to people. I've
Mm-hmm.
been definitely learning how to people a lot lately. I've forgotten quite a few things about, being a social being. Um, and that's tough, but you are
Yeah.
somebody who has been focused quite a lot, not just on the communication of the science, but of the core science itself. So you didn't come to this from journalism. You came to this from real kind of boots on the ground laboratory work. And I'm curious then, I think the main question, you wrote a book called Sticky, The Secret Science of Surfaces. What does it mean for something to stick? What's going on when something sticks to something else?
That's the big question. That is the
Yeah.
whole book, really. I guess the thing, and one of the reasons I called it Sticky, is partly inspired by Mary Roach, who is, I know that you've had on the show before, Cara, and I love her one word book titles.
Oh yeah, she
Um,
just had her on for Fuzz.
yes, yeah, I listened
Yeah.
back to that interview just, I think, a few weeks ago. It was great.
Yeah.
But I really loved the kind of one word titles, and I'm lucky I've gotten to know Mary very well over the past few years, and she's being a real supporter and a good friend to me. So she kind of gave me the thumbs up to call
Oh,
it
I
sticky.
love that.
Yeah. And the reason really was that I kind of wanted to choose a slightly odd word. When the concept for the book started mushing around in my brain, it was kind of called science friction. That was its kind of working title,
Also
I
quite
guess.
clever. Yes.
Yeah. But I almost wanted to kind of argue with people or surprise people a little bit in that the word sticky, it doesn't have any scientific definition, right? It's not a scientific word. There's no metric. There's no metric for stickiness in the way that there is for, say, temperature, right? We can't
Right.
just measure it, but it is a word that we all have some associations with. So when I say the word sticky, and I've done this on Twitter, I've asked people, when if I say the word sticky, what are the things that you associate with it? And everyone kind of has their own association. So it might be honey and the kind of gloopy nature of liquids, or it might be post-it notes, or it might, for some people, it might be like a sandpaper, like a kind of a very high friction interaction. And I just kind of loved how different those things were, that we have this word that we use all the time in daily life, and kind of everyone has a roughly similar idea of what it means, but that word just doesn't exist in science. So there's no scale at which sticky's on one end and slippery is at the other end.
Right. And
Yeah.
are those
So
even really opposites, right?
yeah, quite. They can't be opposites. I argue they can't be opposites because they're not well defined enough to be opposites.
Yeah.
But I liked that. So I kind of, it's a slightly, in a way it doesn't quite capture everything that's in the book, but I like it for that reason. So when we talk about how things stick, I guess most of the interactions are liquids. So when people think about stickiness, they're thinking, like I said, about glues and adhesives and sticky liquids. And there are some metrics that we can use to define how sticky, in inverted commas, honey is, or ketchup is, or water is. We can measure that using viscosity. So viscosity is really a measure of the friction, the frictional interactions between molecules in a liquid. So something that has very high viscosity, what it really means is that those molecules are kind of quite attracted to each other and tightly bound to one another. So they move slowly, and therefore the liquid is kind of gloopy.
Yeah, which is funny because I almost would never go to that means it's more sticky. I would go to that means it's like thicker.
Yeah,
Like that would be
and
my
that's true.
colloquial thing to say, I
No,
think.
that's completely true. But it's often the case that when liquids with high intermolecular forces, they are often also sticky in that they will interact with other compounds. So they will react with water in the air, or they will react with oxygen. So often, kind of gloopy, thick liquids also, can make adhesive bonds with surfaces. So
Yeah.
that's kind of one way to think about it. But then you've also got like the solids on solids. So that's when you're really talking about friction, right? And again, friction might not be the first word that you think of when I ask you to think about something sticky.
When I think of sticky, if you were to just say that sort of in a naive way, like, what do you think of? I think of sugar. I think of
Mm-hmm.
things like welding to each other because of
Mm-hmm.
that sugar glue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I think my mind goes to, okay, what's happening at the molecular level? But then my mind goes to, and I think this is the other big question, and hopefully one that we'll be grappling with during this hour, is there a direct relationship between what's happening at the molecular level and sort of the macro intuitive understanding or feeling that we have about stickiness or attraction or um, things kind of glomming onto one another?
You always ask fantastic questions, Cara. You really do. Um, the answer is kind of yes and no. When I came in to write this book, I had this idea, and I read a little bit about it a long time ago, that we didn't actually have a fundamental understanding of what friction is. Like, that we didn't really understand where this kind of, and when I say friction, I really mean like a resistive force, a force that slows two things down from moving along one another. in its simplest terms.
Right, like
Um,
the brakes on your tires.
yeah,
Like that's
exactly.
always what I think of when I think
Yeah,
of
and
friction,
it's
is
a great
braking.
example, exactly, because it's two sliding surfaces usually, and when the friction between two surfaces is very high, it means they're kind of stuck to one another. They can't move along one another. When the friction between them is low, it usually means they can slide very easily along one another. So that's like the kind of macro scale stuff, and we see that, and we kind of have an instinctive understanding of what that means, and you know when you're sliding something along the ground, that there's a frictional interaction in there. But yeah, I had kind of gone in with this idea that there were still lots of mysteries about what's happening at the atomic scale. So where does friction come from when we're now talking about just a few atoms? And what I kind of realized in the process of researching this book is that we're actually developing a fairly sophisticated understanding of where friction comes from down there, down at the atomic scale. And throughout history, really, we have developed an extremely sophisticated understanding, or at least an ability to manipulate and control friction at the macro scale. But what we're lacking is actually something that joins the two together. So there's a kind of a chasm. So we've got knowledge on one side of it at the nanoscale, and we've got knowledge on the macro scale. But as is so often the case in material science, we've got this gap in the middle in what's called the mesoscale. So there is no way for us to gather all the information we know about a material. So if we perfectly explain everything about a specific material, its density, all of those kind of, its temperature, its atomic structure, everything. We could characterize a material perfectly, but there's nowhere for us to put those numbers into that will then tell us what frictional force that material will exert on another material.
Really? So it's
No.
not really just about, it's funny because, I am very naive when it comes to sort of physics and chemistry. It's definitely not my area of strength in education. I was on the other end of the science scale, learning a lot about biology and psychology.
That's where I fall down drastically.
Yeah. And so I know that sort of in my naive thinking, I go to, well, bonds, right? Isn't this just all about how well it bonds to something else? But is that just only a very small part of the equation?
Yeah, like fundamentally, kind of at the atomic scale, when we're just talking about a few atoms, friction kind of has at least two components. So it has a kind of a chemical interaction. There's a chemical interaction, and there's a physical interaction. So by a chemical interaction, I really mean electrons. Electrons start, to paying attention to one another when they start sliding, when two surfaces are sliding along one another. And that's a really important thing that I should say. When we are defining friction, when we're trying to measure friction, we always have to know what the two materials are that are involved. So there's a number called the coefficient of friction. It's a meaningless number unless you tell me what the two surfaces that are touching are. So coefficient of friction is defined between specific materials, so like wood on steel or ice on whatever, so it has to be pairs of materials.
And is sometimes that material air, like an air
Mm-hmm.
water interface can have
Yeah.
that coefficient as
Yeah,
well?
it
Okay.
can. It tends to be kind of thought about slightly differently, but how we have skin friction. That's kind of how it's looked at when we're talking about air. So how things move through the air, like aircraft, for example, or how even things move through the water. So like swimmers and swimsuits, they will often talk about skin friction, which is the interaction between the surface and the air molecules or the water molecules that are directly touching that surface. So the ones that are
Right,
in
right.
direct contact. It's really all about contact.
Which is
But
cool
yes,
that even when, like, we don't think of something as being a quote material, there is always a material present. Like, there are always things interacting with other things, even if, it's not solid like wood or steel.
and it's really hard. I think when we think of materials, when we discuss materials, we think of them as solids. And I have a bad habit, and possibly other material scientists have a bad habit of doing the same, where actually we're talking about anything. We're really talking about an interface. So we're talking about a point at which two things meet. And those two things could be, they don't have to be two solids. Like you said, they could be air or water and a solid, for example. So yeah, we do have. I certainly have a very bad habit of just clamming them all in together.
Oh, I
Um,
think we all have a solids bias. I definitely think so.
and it's easier to imagine those things, right? When you can
Yeah.
picture something that's physical and solid. But ultimately, atoms aren't solid; they're mostly empty,
True.
right? But
Yeah.
that's very, very difficult thing to kind of imagine in your mind. We like to think of things as fundamentally solid, so it's kind of understandable. But yeah, really, where friction comes in is on the surface. It's between two things, the point at which two things meet. And studying it is very difficult because often you can't see that contact point. If it's two solid materials, you can't see it. You're blocked from view. It's hard to actually get a probe in there and measure things. So measuring surface interactions and measuring friction is hugely challenging. And that's partly why we have this knowledge at the nanoscale. We kind of understand that electrons play a part in how two materials or two surfaces, when they are moving along one another, electrons play a part in that interaction. We also know that there's often a physical component, like I said. So you might sometimes you will knock little pieces off. If you've got two solid surfaces, you might cause things to bend or break or crack. You'll also cause things to vibrate. And those vibrations, at the atomic scale, we kind of think of those, we call them phonons. And we now kind of are beginning to understand that those phonons, these vibrations that happen when two materials move along one another, are the source of the generation of heat in frictional interaction. So when we rub two things together, like our hands on a chilly day, we generate heat. And some of that, one kind of component of that, is actually coming from things that are happening at the atomic level. But yeah, and then we have at the other end of the scale, we have all these numbers. You can look online for coefficients of friction. There are tables and tables and tables of them available on lots of websites if you want to know how easily steel will slide on ice, for example. But those numbers have always been measured experimentally. They have not been predicted. They have not been modeled. They have not been proven from first principles. They have
Oh, so
always
it's always
been
an after the fact. I'm gonna
exactly.
actually do the thing and
I'm going
actually
to do it
measure
and
the
measure it.
drag.
Yeah, and then I'm
Okay.
going to have the number. So what we would love, like what would be the ideal situation, would be to gather together everything we know about friction at the nanoscale and all of these interactions and all of this incredible knowledge that we've gleaned over the past, century about what's happening between atoms and molecules and on surfaces and how crystals form and atomic lattices form. If we could take all of that and design some sort of equation that we could just plug numbers into, and then out will pop a coefficient of friction for that material interacting with some other material, that would make life a lot easier for those who are interested in surface interactions. But that's a chasm that we haven't yet managed to cross.
Okay. And that's something that sort of material scientists, physicists, engineers, chemists are all really actively working on.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. Understanding that would be a huge game changer.
And so, when we think about this idea of, frictional interactions between two different things, whatever those things might be, obviously those kinds of interactions are fundamentally important to how things work, to how things move, to how things are built, to how structures form. But they're also things that we can potentially manipulate, right? Like I'm going right in my head to like lubricants, like ways that something's kind of sticky, squirt some WD-40 on it. Like something isn't isn't sliding past one another. Like there are tools that we have in our sort of disposal or at our disposal to adjust something's coefficient, I suppose. Is that because we're actually we're not really physically changing the structure of the two objects, but we're actually adding a third object to the mix?
Yeah, precisely that. What we're usually doing when we put in a lubricant into a system, is that we're just giving the materials something easier to slide on. That's effectively what we're
Yeah.
doing. So you kind of need to keep the lubricant in there. And that can be quite challenging depending on the design of your engine or whatever your component is that you're trying to lubricate. And there are so, like you said, we have so many of these lubricants available to us, and they're usually designed with specific applications in mind. So, we do have some general lubricants, like you said, WD-40, fantastic product. We all use it and love it. That's kind of a general lubricant that we can use in lots of situations. You can also use graphite. You could, just the nib of your pencil. That gives you a very low friction surface, so that can be a lubricant in a pinch. But usually, lubricants are designed for specific purposes. For particular temperature ranges or applications, like in an engine, they need to be able to keep their liquid form and stay in situ between the two components at very high temperatures and maybe very high vibrations as well. So
Right.
yeah, so a lubricant is, you want to get the right one for your application, really. That's the kind of key thing. There isn't really one that does everything for everybody.
It's funny because I'm thinking, how can my head not go here, right? But I'm thinking that, and you sort of kind of nodded to this, that one of the hard things about just lubricating two surfaces in order to kind of reduce their stickiness, is that almost by nature of the stickiness of the surfaces, it's going to rub the lubricant away. And of course, my
Absolutely.
head goes to sex. I can't help it. And that's why it's so great that people kind of make their own. But if they need additional help, that additional help has to be reapplied.
Yeah,
Right?
certainly does. In most situations, you need to reapply your lubricant. It's very important. Don't skimp on the lubricant.
Yeah, it's what a frustrating conundrum for engineers to think like, oh, the very thing that we need, by virtue of the reason we need it, we have to keep needing it because the
No.
two objects are forcing it out off the surface.
Yeah, if that
Like that's
motion
what it
continues,
is.
exactly. If that motion continues, that lubricant is going to be used up. So yeah, it is really challenging. And the process of designing a lubricant, again, it's kind of been something that's been quite experimental, and we've been doing it really since the 18th century, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. But yeah, at the beginning, it was definitely not a science. It was very much like, let's just mix up some compounds that are, we've got some oil, chuck it in there. We've got some other byproducts of the fossil fuel industry. Let's just chuck that in there. That was definitely the approach. And to a degree, in some cases, it kind of still is, in that, they've got recipes that work. So they just kind of use them, really. But as our technology is kind of getting more high tech and in some cases, more demanding, when we're putting things in space and we're putting things on the surface of Mars, you're not necessarily going to want the same lubricant that you'll use on your weekend with your partner. you're going to
Right.
want
Yeah.
you're going to
There's
want a
no
really
jelly going to Mars.
specific. You're going to want something really specific that's designed to work in those particular conditions. So we have started to become a bit more scientific. I say we, like I'm a lubrication engineer, but lubrication engineers are
You're
getting.
honorary. Come on, you've spent enough time with them now.
I guess I'm a fangirl, maybe. But yeah, they've started to get much more scientific in their approach to designing lubricants, and part of this is motivated by a real desire to be less reliant on the fossil fuel industry, because, like I said, most of them are byproducts or use byproducts from fossil fuels to be made. So now
Yeah,
that the
they're
pressures
oil based. I mean,
are
that's what we
absolutely.
think of when we think of
Mm-hmm.
lubricants is oil. It's
100%.
slippery.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So we're trying to get away from that and moving towards greener lubricants. That means you need to be a bit more scientific in your approach.
Mm-hmm. And so, lubricating surfaces is one way to reduce their stickiness. But I can imagine that there are other ways that engineers and scientists reduce the stickiness at an interface.
Yeah, I mean, lubricants is kind of the easy way to do it, which so tends to be kind of the default. You can, of course, and this sounds silly, but you can change your materials, right? You can change your material so that your pair of materials naturally have a lower coefficient of friction. So, we used to have wooden skates. but wood on ice has a higher coefficient of friction than steel on ice. So we've moved to steel blades and steel ice skates. So they,
Wow,
you know,
people used to skate on wood, so they would
yeah.
just make these huge like troughs in the ice, I can imagine.
Well, apparently, and I don't know, haven't found, and I'm not an archaeologist, and I don't necessarily trust that this is correct, but I have read that there's actually some evidence in the Scandinavian countries of using bone as
Ah,
early ice skates. Yeah, in areas
yeah, that would
where
be
they would
better.
exactly because they're quite strong, especially if you use them in the correct orientation. Bones can be really strong. So yeah, we've gone from bone to wood to steel now, and steel is about as good as it gets in terms of gliding your body across the ice.
Yeah. And so we can change the material, we can spray something or squirt something on the material. We can
Yep.
also like coat the
Yep.
material with
Yeah, for
something, right?
sure.
I mean, I can't help but go to Teflon. There's a whole
Hmm.
documentary about Teflon. It's actually kind of scary. Have you seen it? The
Yeah,
Devil
I
You Know?
haven't. You know what?
It's
I need to
it's
see it
very
because
good.
you're the second person to mention it to me. So yeah, I need to.
I am a documentary just like nut. Is it called The Devil You Know? Now I'm confused. Let me see. Teflon documentary. Yeah, there's multiple The Devil You Knows on TV, but oh, The Devil We Know, that's why.
Oh,
Yeah, The Devil
okay.
We Know. But yeah, it's obviously it's a very it's an incredible molecule,
Mm.
compound, whatever you
Hmm.
want to call it, that is also so ubiquitous that it's in most of our blood.
Yeah, it is pretty terrifying, and it's been since the 1990s, as far as I understand, that we started to properly look into the potential health risks of Teflon, or specifically of two of its ingredients. So I can't remember what they stand for, but it's PFOA and PFOS. They're the two really problematic ingredients in Teflon, and yeah, they've been effectively banned from their use, but yeah, they were used for an extremely long time before that happened.
Yeah, yeah, and that's really what they do dive deep into that on this in this documentary. And I
Yeah.
remember the thing that stood out the most to me was that they went to they wanted to see if the people who were working in the factories had like, oh, what if we can detect it in their body fluids, in their blood,
Mm.
whatever. And they needed to find a reference sample to compare it, and they couldn't. No blood draw that they could find didn't have it.
Wow,
And
that's
that was
terrifying.
really telling. Yeah, and the only way that they could look at it was to find stored blood from before its advent.
Wow. Yeah,
And
I mean,
so
it's
it's
so widely
interesting how
used today. Yeah.
yeah. And I guess that probably has something to do with its stickiness,
Yeah.
like the fact that we are all, we eat food on pans that have been sprayed with Teflon. And of course it's used for all sorts of things. It's
Mhm.
used to and all these things reduce stickiness. Like it's used
Mhm.
to Scotch guard couches. I think I'm using Scotch guard as a verb, but that's the brand name,
Yeah.
right? Like Kleenex. Do you guys do that in New Zealand? Do you have your own brands that you do that with? Do you
Yeah,
say
I think, well,
Kleenex?
no, I think we say like Hoover's the one I say a lot, whereas I don't
Hoover.
actually
I've
have a
seen that in the
Hoover.
UK.
Yeah.
Yeah, people Hoover. That's
I have a
true.
different branded vacuum cleaner, but I still call it a Hoover.
Oh, that's the big one. See, in America, we say Band-Aid
Oh
instead
yeah.
of
Hmm.
bandage, which you guys call plasters.
Pastures, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But everybody here just says Band-Aid, even if they're talking about a different brand. And then we all say Kleenex when we're talking about a tissue, like a facial
Yeah.
tissue.
Well, I
Huh.
mean, I guess it's true for Teflon as well, because Teflon's also trademark, because its
Yeah,
real name is
exactly.
polytetrafluoroethylene,
Wow,
PTFE.
that was
Yeah.
impressive.
Wait. Had to
That
go
just
through it
rolled right
slowly.
out of you. Yeah, that's really funny and a total tangent, but whatever. So yeah, these types of things, and not to like vilify Teflon, because yes,
Mhm.
obviously those are big problems, but there's a reason it's ubiquitous because it
Yeah.
works, right?
Yeah. No, precisely.
It was a game changer when it was first developed.
Yeah, and do you know where it came from? I mean, you probably know this from the
I
documentary.
probably, but I saw it years ago, so I don't remember.
But yeah, it was used in the Manhattan Project in the 1940s. It's not. I think a lot of people think of it as a product from the space industry. There's a lot of these. Oh, this came because of the Apollo missions or whatever, and sometimes that's true. But in this case, it came out. It was used. It's because it's very corrosion resistant. So it was used, I think, in storage canisters at the Manhattan Project. So it has a bit of a problematic history, even before it was put onto all of our frying pans.
Wow. Yeah. And then, of course, it served the same purpose, whether it's for the food that we eat or for storing probably these compounds that were necessary. The whole point of it is to keep the stuff from sticking to the surface.
Yeah, exactly. And the way that it does it is partly because of it's really because of its molecular structure. So Teflon is a very long chains of carbon, like a backbone of carbon, and they're surrounded by atoms of fluorine. And the bonds between the carbon and the fluorine, they're often described as the strongest bonds in organic chemistry. You know, they're really incredibly strong. And practically what that means is that Teflon is incredibly unattractive to everything that is not Teflon. So
Ah,
yeah, so the person I interviewed for the book said fluorocarbon groups dislike anything and everything in the universe that isn't fluorocarbon. So yeah, so like when you put it onto when you bring a compound, something else in contact with Teflon, it basically just cannot react with it. So they can't kind of get in there and interact with the molecules. The molecules are completely disinterested in reacting with anything. So that's what makes it so kind of slippery and also like so ubiquitous, because you can think about so many applications for it. You know, it's used a lot in the medical industry. Anytime that you've had, a smear test, for example, it's very likely that there's been a Teflon coating on the thing that's been used, and to make it a bit less, to reduce the discomfort a bit. And lots of anything that goes inside your body often has some Teflon on it. But again, this is the Teflon that doesn't have the PFOS and the PFOAs in it.
good.
That it
Yeah.
used to, yeah,
Well, yeah, I can
just to reassure.
imagine. Yes, yes, good. On the swabs that are going inside my body.
Yes, yes.
But I can imagine that, yeah, it's probably used. I'm just trying to think of all the different, we mentioned like coating on furniture and clothing to make them stain resistant. And of course, even your car's windshield, I know that many of the like wiper fluids that are used have some sort of molecule in them that make rain not stick to your window. It just
Yeah,
balls up and kind of rolls off.
it's true. And actually, what's interesting about those is a lot of those compounds, they they don't kind of it's just an interesting one, because what they do is they usually they're effectively putting a coating on your windshield, a kind of a temporary coating. So the coating wets the surface of the glass entirely, so it's just spreads out instantly and forms a coating, and then that coating is what reject everything else, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of like interesting. And there has been some research over the years to try and actually develop, and with some success I should say, to try to develop proper kind of self-cleaning glass, so that the glass itself
Whoa.
is water repellent and dirt repellent. And that kind of involves a bit of chemistry and a bit of patterning the surface, so it's kind of coated in these nano bumps. It takes inspiration from the lotus leaf. um,
Ah.
yeah, so there's been kind of a moderate success, but they're incredibly expensive to make. These
Right,
glass
and it's not like you can
glass
just
panels.
spray Teflon on your
Nah,
windshield because then you
no,
wouldn't be able to see.
exactly. So you kind of have to. What you want is a coating that almost kind of disappears visually for you, but stays in contact with the glass for long enough to repel all the other stuff that hits your windscreen.
So I'm wondering, there's all these different ways that we can reduce stickiness, but there are obviously a million examples in which we want things to stick.
Oh yeah.
And, what's sort of I don't want to say the opposite, but what is the alternative approach? I'm a scientist or just an everyday person who's trying to figure out how to get these things to stick. I'll go for the tape, I'll go for the glue. These are the things that first are the gums. These things kind of come to mind. And is that what's happening in the lab? Basically making molecular glues and tapes?
Yeah, effectively, it is. Like I spoke to a friend of mine the other day, and she was saying, "Well, I can't imagine ever working in a lab where I don't use blue tack like everywhere." So yeah, to hold on to your samples, and yeah, we in the lab, the kind of commercial sticky products are used a lot. But yeah, on the molecular scale, there are some things, and there are some materials that are particularly good at being grippy. And I guess the most obvious one is rubber. Again, one of these materials that we completely take for granted because we use it so much. But rubber is incredibly good at gripping onto surfaces, which is it's why we use it on our shoes, and why we make our running tracks with rubber in them. There's a reason that rubber is so good, is so popular, and that's partly because it is a very weird, technical term, a very weird material. It's what's called a viscoelastic fluid or viscoelastic material. And what that means is that it sits somewhere between an elastic solid, so think of it like a spring, and a very viscous fluid like the honey and things that we talked about earlier. Um, when you compress an elastic solid like a spring, you kind of apply a squeezing force to it, you compress the spring, and then when you release that, the spring bounces back and retains its normal shape, right? When you've got a sticky fluid and you try to compress that, it doesn't quite happen in the same way. There's kind of a bit of a delay between the force that you apply and the fluid kind of responding to that. And that's because of this very high internal friction that we see in viscous fluids. So when you try to squeeze a viscous fluid, you kind of lose a lot of energy to that internal friction. So you've got a delay between applying the force and the fluid responding to it. And rubber sits bang in the middle of those two types of materials. So it sits between, yeah, so this viscoelasticity is really what makes it so incredibly useful, because like in a tire, in like a car tire, or in the book I talk about Formula One, in a whole chapter, and tires are kind of the star really of that chapter. But when a rubber tire rolls along a racetrack, the rubber deforms, as we know. It's a kind of a soft-ish fluid material. So it deforms and it kind of slips and it flows over all these bumps that racetracks are covered in. Even the smoothest racetrack is actually rough on the scale of a tire. And that, because of this viscoelastic nature of rubber, that interaction kind of generates a resistive force between the tire and the road. So there's a slight delay, there's a slight kind of holding on between the rubber and the road. So that gives kind of one way for the tire to grip on the road. But if you're also a Formula One tire that's been highly engineered and is usually very, very smooth, it can make such intimate contact with a racetrack. It's about, there's a distance of less than 1 nanometer between the rubber molecules and the track surface. And that actually means that it can tap into molecular adhesion. So it's kind of a temporary bond that forms between the rubber molecules of the tire and the asphalt surface of the track. So it has two different ways of gripping onto surfaces. So rubber is just it's a magic material for that reason, because it gives us grip exactly when we need it.
Oh, wow. And that's why, of course, it has so many applications.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, we are so reliant on it. You think about how often you've relied on it. You kind of only become aware of how reliant you are on it when it doesn't work for some reason. When you slip over on ice, or you've left your tires for too long and they lose their grip. You're never more aware of how important rubber friction is than when you have none of it.
Yeah, and then when you're wearing the wrong shoes for the wrong
Absolutely.
terrain. Yeah. What this is such a silly question, but what is rubber? Like, where do we get it? Is it a natural product or is it synthetic?
No, it was originally a natural product. It was kind of generated produced by certain groups of trees,
That's
and
what
it's
I
been
thought,
used.
but I wasn't sure
Yeah,
if the rubber trees were a misnomer or if rubber actually did originally come from rubber trees.
yeah, they definitely did.
Oh,
And
okay.
but the rubber that they produce, it doesn't stay hard when it gets warm. Like, it kind of melts and becomes a liquid again. So the rubber that we use, and the kind of black rubber that we see a lot in tires, like bike tires and car tires, that's gone through an additional process. It's called vulcanization, and it adds in some other compounds and forms extra links between all of the compounds. So that produces a kind of a rubbery, if you know what I mean, a rubbery material, but it's much more durable and it stays solid at higher temperatures. So that invention of that process was really what kickstarted the rubber industry. These days, we don't use so much natural rubber. Most of what we see now is some blend of polymers, again, usually made from fossil fuels, and lots of other additives. So yeah, most of the rubber we see today is not natural rubber.
So I can imagine that there are also pushes to sort of move or develop a material that is a little bit more green, that's more biodegradable, that comes from a more renewable source. But have we not really been able to find anything that stands up to that same kind of petroleum-based rubber?
Yeah, there are several tire companies who are really looking heavily into this and investing a lot of money in it. So I'm pretty confident that we will start to see some progress in that direction. Although, it's, if only it were 20 years earlier. A good friend of mine, Kit Chapman, has a book coming out which is called Racing Green, and it's all about kind of the move towards green technologies in
Oh,
motorsport.
did I think I had him, right?
Oh,
Him
maybe,
on
I
my
don't
show?
know. Oh,
Did he
maybe.
did he do a book about the periodic table?
Yes, he did. Yes, and
Yes,
he's got
I've
another.
totally had him on the show. He was lovely,
He
so
is lovely.
lovely.
So yeah, he's
Oh,
written another book, which I think is out really soon, if not
oh,
already.
cool.
And he goes into loads of detail actually about these new alternative materials to the rubber that we use.
Right. I mean, obviously, it's fundamental to our future to be thinking about, kind of we were able to innovate in an extractive and sort of non-forward thinking way, and we got all of these amazing tools at our disposal, and now we're paying for it, and we really do have to think about, how can we use the technology that we've developed and or the sort of outcome of that technology development and innovate even further so that we're utilizing materials that are kind of kinder. And really, in a way, that brings me to another question. Kind of stick with my very convoluted thinking here in the evening time. Um, how how deep did you dig in your research, and of course in your writing as well, into this sort of concept of biomimicry? Like, how much are engineers looking to nature and the stickiness or non-stickiness of nature to try to find inspiration or innovation?
Yeah, this is a good one because I have a kind of partly a good answer and partly a bad answer. I'll go with the
Yeah.
bad answer first, which is that I had planned to write a lot more about biomimicry, like particularly the use of kind of bio-inspired adhesives in the medical industry, because that's a huge growing field. Looking at mussels and other undersea creatures and how they anchor themselves to rocks. It's quite difficult to anchor yourself
Right,
to a wet
underwater.
rock. Yeah.
Yeah.
um, Usually the way they do it is by pushing out all of the water, so the contact they make is actually dry. But in saying that,
Cool.
yeah, there's been loads of work done on kind of taking inspiration from nature's adhesives to use them in the medical industry, and it ended up just being a topic I just didn't have time to look into. And this was pre-pandemic, so it does feel like a bit of an oversight to not have included something about the medical industry in the book, but it is what it is.
But you do
But
talk about geckos,
I
right? And
do,
about
oh
gecko
man,
feet, which is like a really exciting thing for a lot of engineers
yeah,
to be
and
sort of
that
launching
is
from.
absolutely, and that is an area where biomimicry is a huge thing. So there's a whole chapter on the gecko. I initially thought it was going to be a chapter that would cover the stickiness of lots of different animals, but I just got totally hooked on the gecko, like obsessed, and I just kept writing. And I was like, well, it's just going to be about the gecko. But yeah, like I got to hang out, like, yeah, back in the before times when we could travel. I got to spend some time with Mark Kotkowski, who's at Stanford University, and he and lots of his colleagues I chatted to over the years. They do an awful lot of work on bio-inspired devices and robots, and the gecko's a big kind of inspiration for them. Not just, they actually had like a sticky bot that kind of looked a bit like a gecko with 4 feet, and it had rubbery toes. So that was a cool project. But really, what's kind of come out of that is the adhesive itself, like these pads, these silicone pads that take inspiration from the structures that exist on a gecko's foot. That's something that's actually going pretty well. It's starting already to be used in factories where you have to grip and pick up kind of awkwardly shaped things. These gecko pads actually help to improve the grip that you get, but because they themselves are not sticky, they don't leave any sort of residue on the things that they move around. That's seen them used in the space industry for the same reason. They've been trialed on the Vomit Comet. They've even been trialed at the International Space Station, um, to show that this is the type of stickiness that is, works really well at low gravity. It doesn't leave any residue behind, and it can give you and you don't need to kind of have anything extra beyond the actual material to get a grip. You don't have to have pressured air or anything like that, or any clamps. So yeah, that's a huge, like the gecko, because the way that a gecko grips, we could never have invented it.
Ah,
We
really?
if it didn't exist in nature, we would never have known to do it that way. It's not an obvious structure. And what it looks like, so if you look at a little gecko's foot, they'll usually have 4 or 5 toes, depending on the species. And on each of the toes, they'll have these kind of flaps of skin, and they're called lamellae. Um, so you've got like the foot. The foot itself is quite flexible. Sometimes they'll have claws as well. That helps them grip to rough surfaces like trees. The lamellae kind of help them because they can conform quite a bit. They can flex a bit, so that allows them to grip to slightly less rough surfaces. But as the gecko continued to be studied, and our microscopes, better microscopes began to be invented, what was realized was that these strips of skin, these lamellae, are actually covered in forests of hairs, much, much smaller hairs, and they're called setae. And they're like, wow, okay, so maybe it's just a really high surface area thing. So when a gecko is on a smooth surface, these these hairs, they increase the surface area, and that's what makes them grip. But actually, they're even smarter than that because if you look at the end of each one of these hairs, each hair has like a really bad case of split ends, right? So each hair kind of splays out into lots of other smaller hairs, and they're called spatulae because of the shape of them, which I love. But yeah, so they are so small, and they can make such intimate contact with the wall that effectively their electrons are interacting with the electrons on whatever surface it's climbing.
No,
Yeah, so
that's so cool.
it is genuinely incredible. And the really cool thing about it is they can switch that stickiness on and off rapidly. Because if you've ever seen a gecko move, they move really quickly. they they can run really fast, and they do that because their stickiness is entirely structural, right? There's no gloopy thing. They don't secrete anything as far as we know. This is just about this hierarchical structure, this bigger features with smaller features layered on top of it. All they have to do is to curl their toes back. They just change the angle that those hairs, that those spatulae, those tiny, tiny hairs make with the wall to decrease the interaction. So they
Oh,
can
so they're
just,
not retracting, like, they're not being
no,
sucked back into their feet, they're not closing the little split ends so that they make one fat hair again, they're just pulling their foot back a little
they're
bit.
just pulling their foot back a little. And
Ah,
that's, yeah,
cool.
it's so cool. And like that, I think is kind of, it's probably the most exciting kind of biomimicry thing that is ongoing. It's been ongoing for a long time, right? It's just not, people have been obsessed with the gecko for a long time, but it's really now that we're seeing, proper commercial use of this technology. And just to say, right, the commercial systems that we have, they're nowhere near as good as a gecko foot,
Right,
right?
right. But I guess we couldn't really get there before until we had, like, nanomaterials, right? Like, we
Yeah,
need small things.
we do. But actually, we can kind of copy and tap into a lot of the same ideas, even with slightly bigger features. So these commercial materials, they don't have spatulae, they don't have features that are that small. Their features are actually pretty large compared to the gecko's, compared to this kind of hierarchical structure that the gecko has. But it's still, they've used a flexible material that allows them to get much more conformity to surfaces. So they use a silicone, and a gecko's foot is a bit stiffer than that. So they're kind of going, oh well, we can make some of these small structures that we can change the angle of. They're kind of wedges effectively that splay outwards when you place one of these pieces of material on the wall, you tug it down slightly, that splays out these silicone wedges, and that makes sufficient contact that it's usually good enough to grip and to pick something up. Like geckos go so far beyond that, but we don't need to go as far as they have gone for it to be a useful development.
Right. Geckos like can climb on the ceiling.
Yeah, easily,
And
no problem. And they could
no
probably
problem.
carry several kilograms of mass on their back at the same
So
time. Yeah, they're
cool.
amazing.
Yeah, they just have to figure out how to not get that stuff to fall off their backs.
Yeah, exactly. Because they're
like,
flying.
only my feet are sticky. Oh no. They'd have to put it all in their mouth or something. Oh, that's so cool. Gosh, there's so many awesome things in your book. There's so much to learn about, something that we, I think, legit take for granted in not just nature around us, but in all of the materials that we use every day. Like, the more we've been talking, the more I've been thinking about like the laptop that I'm looking at and all of the coatings. And I have this little laptop table next to, so my podcast studio, I've got like a table, because used to be people would come here and we would talk, in
Yeah,
person.
wow.
Weird,
Crazy.
right? Yeah. So there's like another seat that's just always empty now.
Oh.
Yeah, it's really sad. And then I have this little laptop kind of table that rolls up, but I didn't realize when I ordered it that it's like on a diagonal, like it's
Oh, right.
tilted. And then I
Oh,
was like, crap, my laptop just slide around. I was like, who invented this? And there's no mechanism to make it straight. So I bought like a sticky pad. And they
nice.
exist. They're these like rubbery, kind
Mm-hmm.
of silicone-y pads that you just slap to the table, and then you set your laptop on it and it does not move. And every so often it gets too dusty and you just run it underwater and it re-sticks. And I mean, I guess that's how reusable lint rollers work too.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. Yeah.
this is your book. Like, this is like what you're talking about. It's right in front of me. That's so cool. It's literally everywhere. And of course, you're
Yeah.
probably used to that. You see stickiness all the time, don't you?
Yeah, I do now. I think like it's become a real kind of obsession, and it's been a really fun thing for me to explore. Like we said right at the start, I knew a lot of these things going in, or at least I knew them at some point in my history. But there were so many other things that I had the wrong idea about. This idea that we don't understand friction. That's not true. I also thought that we totally understood what it is that makes ice slippery. And actually, it's only very recently that we realized why ice is slippery. I thought all of these things and I was wrong. And that's a joy. As an
Yeah.
author, as a nerd, I think that used to scare me. When I started out as a baby science writer, I'd find that daunting. But now I just find it thrilling. And I can't imagine writing about stuff without some mystery and some learning involved, really.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that there's always something in the most mundane experiences, the most mundane encounters. There's always something lurking kind of beneath the surface that is fundamentally fascinating that we just don't know. Or like, and whether I'm saying humanity doesn't know yet, or maybe just me as an individual doesn't know because I never took the time to look it up. um you know every interaction, every little thing, I think has that potential. And that's why books and writing like the way that you write is so important, because it sheds light on the everyday. So now when you look at the things that you engage in your environment, you're doing it in a slightly different way. You were able to have a little bit of a paradigm shift, a little bit of a perspective shift, and things are like, it's like there's a sheen on everything now. It's a little bit brighter when you can understand it.
Thank you. That's a lovely thing to say, and that's always my goal with this stuff. Like I want to bring my readers along with me when we're learning things together, I guess. And if there's one thing that I want people to take away is that we don't actually understand everything, and that's cool.
Yeah, and that's a
You
good
know,
thing. Yeah. Oh, I love it. Well, the last time that we chatted, I probably asked you my closing two questions, because I do that with everybody unless
oh
I
yeah,
completely forgot.
oh
And
yeah.
of course, I feel terrible because I didn't look back to see what your answers were. So we'll just pretend I never asked.
Okay,
Um,
okay.
and whether you end up telling me the exact same thing you told me 5 years ago, or yeah, gosh, 6 years ago, or whether it's something completely new. Let's take a new stab at it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Why not?
Okay. So when you think to the future in whatever context is relevant to you right now, so obviously this could be informed by the sort of collective trauma that we're all dealing
Hmm.
with. It could be informed by the work that you do, by anything in your personal life, or by something much larger, global, cosmic, whatever. First, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night? The thing that is concerning to you? Maybe you're feeling pessimistic, maybe even cynical. Where are you struggling? And then on the flip side of that, where are you finding hope and optimism? And I mean authentic hope and optimism, not like, pithy Instagram
Yeah.
hope.
I like that you do it in this order. It's nice.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, I don't want to end like really
No,
sad. So we'll
no,
start with the bad.
quite.
Yeah.
Okay, so the thing that I'm most concerned about, I guess, is how loud and disinformation is at this point in history. I feel like we've never had better access to experts thanks to social media, etc. And we've never known more about how the universe works and how medicines work and all of that stuff. And yet we're somehow in this situation where scientists are distrusted by large swathes of the global population, and people with lived experience lived experiences of different things are undermined continuously. So that and I don't really know what the way out of that is. So that's definitely a big concern for me. What am I optimistic about? I think one thing I'm really optimistic about is that the scientific workforce is becoming more diverse and more representative of wider society. So, we're seeing more women and indigenous people and people of color, disabled people, those from the LGBTQ plus community. We're starting to see those people working in the workforce. And as a result of that, we're seeing more scientists realize that they can and they should and that they have a responsibility to talk about issues that would traditionally have been seen as being outside the world of science. I definitely I used to get, oh, stick to the politics, stick to the science, stuff online, don't be talking about politics, but I don't get that as much anymore. So yeah, I do think we still need to do much more in this space, to make science more accessible to everyone. But I am comforted that the future of science will be, or hopeful maybe, that the future of science will be less dominated by white Western men.
Yeah. Me too. Here, here, sister. Well, gosh, it has been such a joy talking with you again. I'm so glad that we were able to do this. I've missed you. This has been fascinating. I hope everybody runs out right now. You can actually pre-order the book, Sticky, The Secret Science of Surfaces, anywhere you get books. It's available here in the US, and I say here, which is exclusionary, and I apologize, but just because probably the vast majority of my listenership is in the US, maybe 80% plus. But if you have access to the UK version, right? If you live in the UK, or I think in Australia, New Zealand, or in other countries where that's the market, you can already get the book. It has the same name in both markets, Sticky, The Secret Science of Surfaces. But yeah, February 1st here in the US. So
Yeah, and if
exciting.
you're not already sick of hearing my voice, there's even an audiobook edition.
Oh, you got to read your own book edition. Oh, that's so exciting.
It was terrifying, Cara. It was terrifying. I did my
No,
best.
I can tell you, people are going to love it. At least here in the US, like we go gaga for an Irish accent. So it's like there's just something about the way our brains are wired. So yeah, Laurie, thank you so much. I had an absolute blast with you.
Likewise, Cara. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.